You've probably heard the glowing stories about ancient Greece, the birthplace of philosophy, democracy, and timeless art. Marble temples, heroic myths, and the Olympic spirit still dominate how we imagine it. But peel back that polished image and you'll find a society where power was measured not just in politics or war, but in the intimate control one person could have over another. This wasn't the noble civilization your schoolbooks celebrated. It was a place where cruelty often hid in plain sight, wrapped in the language of education, honor, or faith. Behind every columned hall stood laws and customs that turned human lives into possessions. What you're about to hear isn't a footnote in history. It's the part deliberately left out, a chain of practices so normalized, so deeply rooted, that they shape generations, and still echo through the foundations of our modern world. One of the most normalized and disturbing customs in ancient Greece was the relationship between older men and adolescent boys. Today it would be called exploitation. Back then it was praised as a noble tradition. Wealthy men in their 30s or 40s would select boys barely into their teens, often from influential families, and pursue them under the guise of mentorship. This courtship wasn't hidden. It played out in marketplaces, at athletic events, and even in the boy's own home. The older man would present lavish gifts, fine cloaks, hunting gear, even animals, as symbols of favor. Families, eager for social connections, often encouraged the arrangement, seeing it as a path to political opportunity for their sons. Public art celebrated these pairings. Pottery, statues, and poetry immortalized the supposed beauty of the youth and the virtue of the bond. But beneath the layers of ceremony lay a calculated power dynamic. The boy was expected to be passive, receptive, and obedient, traits equated with submission. When the boy reached manhood, the relationship ended abruptly. This wasn't to protect him, but to preserve the elder's dominant role. Continuing with an adult partner would risk reversing the balance of power. The most chilling aspect was the society-wide agreement that such intimacy was essential for shaping a boy into a worthy man. In truth, it was an institutionalized system of grooming, cloaked in the language of culture, education, and honor. And it thrived in plain sight. If Athens dressed exploitation in the robes of culture, Sparta forged it into armor. In this militaristic city-state, boys left their homes at the age of 7 to enter the agoge, a brutal training system designed to create fearless warriors. Discipline, endurance, and loyalty were drilled into them from dawn to dusk. But alongside the physical trials lurked something darker. Older soldiers were assigned as mentors to the young recruits. These bonds were promoted as essential for building trust and unity in battle. In reality, they often crossed into coercive intimacy that the boys had no power to refuse. Refusal didn't just mean personal shame, it could end a military career before it began. Selection was methodical. The most physically attractive or athletically promising boys were claimed by the most respected warriors, creating a hierarchy of privilege and favoritism. Those chosen received better treatment, food, and protection. Those ignored were left to struggle alone, often mocked by their peers. Daily life in the agoge kept the boys dependent. They were deliberately underfed and inadequately clothed, forcing them to rely on their patron for comfort and survival. This dependency blurred the line between loyalty and submission. By the time a boy graduated into the Spartan army, the lessons were clear. Obedience to authority was absolute, and intimacy could be a tool of control as potent as the spear. Sparta's strength may have rested on discipline, but part of that discipline was built on the silent endurance of those who could never say no. Beyond the training grounds and public ceremonies, oppression in ancient Greece also lived inside the home. Marriage was rarely about affection or partnership. It was an arrangement between men, with the bride's voice absent entirely. Girls as young as 12 or 13 could be given to men often twice or 3 times their age. These unions were less about family harmony and more about securing alliances, property, and heirs. Once married, a woman's legal existence nearly vanished. She could not own property, vote, conduct business, or represent herself in court. Every decision, from finances to travel, required her husband's approval. The law made her fully dependent, and tradition demanded her silence. Public life was off limits. In many cities, respectable women were expected to remain indoors, rarely appearing at gatherings where men were present. The home became both her domain and her prison. Meanwhile, her husband could openly keep mistresses, visit brothels, or maintain relationships with male lovers without facing social condemnation. If a woman dared to stray, the punishment was severe: death in some cases, lifelong exile in others. Jealousy, even without action, could be painted as a threat to social order. This double standard stripped women of agency and dignity. The law portrayed them as fragile dependents. Society treated them as possessions. And while historians often frame Greek democracy as the birth of equality, half the population lived under a system that denied them even the most basic human freedoms. For them, democracy was a door that never opened. Some of the most profitable exploitation in ancient Greece wore the mask of religion. In cities like Corinth, the grand temple of Aphrodite was famous for its sacred servants, women dedicated to the goddess, yet serving men in ways far removed from worship. Families, especially those in poverty, would offer their daughters to the temple, believing it fulfilled a spiritual duty or brought divine favor. In reality, these women became part of a highly organized system of sexual labor. The temple acted as both a religious center and a business enterprise, generating enormous income from the services its attendants provided. The women themselves saw none of the profit. Their bodies were considered property of the institution, and their lives were dictated by its rules. Living quarters, bathing facilities, and strict schedules kept the operation running like clockwork. Priests managed transactions, and the spiritual language surrounding the practice blurred the lines between faith and exploitation. For many, resistance wasn't just dangerous, it was framed as blasphemy. Religious indoctrination often convinced the women that their role was sacred, that they were chosen by the goddess herself. This belief made it harder to recognize the abuse for what it was. What temples called holy service was, in truth, state-sanctioned sexual slavery, legitimized by ritual, protected by law, and celebrated by society. And because it stood at the intersection of faith and economy, it was nearly untouchable, ensuring the cycle endured for generations under the shadow of marble columns and golden altars. Among the most unsettling aspects of ancient Greek life was the way mythology was used to excuse behavior that violated every boundary. Myths told of gods transforming into animals to seduce or assault mortals. Stories like Zeus becoming a bull to carry off Europa were not cautionary tales. They were celebrated in art, theater, and festivals, giving divine precedent to acts we would see as deeply taboo. These tales blurred moral lines, allowing real-life imitations to hide in plain sight. When culture praises the union of God and beast, it becomes easier to dismiss questions about where human desire should end. In certain rural areas, stories of such acts were treated with curiosity rather than condemnation, especially when tied to fertility rituals or local legends. Philosophers debated these practices in detached terms, asking whether they were natural or simply another form of human expression. Medical writings even described injuries from animal contact with the same clinical tone used for any other ailment, as if nothing were morally amiss. The casualness was perhaps the most disturbing part. It showed that consent, already fragile in Greek society, disappeared entirely when myths could be invoked. What was divine in a story could become permissible in reality. By elevating these acts through religious and cultural celebration, Greece erased the moral barrier between imagination and action. The result was a society where even the most extreme violations could be reframed as tradition, leaving no space for the powerless to question, let alone refuse.